In the heart of a treacherous African jungle, a safari turns deadly when guide Samuel Kweku is shot in the dead of night. Was it the boastful hunter, Clarence Hargrove, with his gleaming rifle? The ambitious photographer, Evelyn Carter, hiding secrets in her camera? Or the stern ranger, Thomas Reed, guarding more than the wildlife? Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose sharp mind unravels a web of poaching, betrayal, and murder. As shadows stalk the camp, one truth emerges. No secret can hide from her. The fatal safari, a mystery where danger lurks in every leaf. Chapter 1. The Jungle Beckons. Miss Jane Marple sat primly on the deck of the weathered steamer, her gloved hands folded over her knitting, which she had brought despite the oppressive heat of the African river. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and vegetation, and the water churned a murky brown beneath the boat's steady churn. She had been coaxed into this safari by her nephew Raymond, who, with his usual enthusiasm, insisted it would rejuvenate her. Miss Marple, however, was not so sure. Adventures in her experience often brought trouble, and her sharp eyes missed little of the undercurrents among her fellow travelers. The party was small, assembled for a week-long trek through the jungle to observe its wildlife. Mr. Clarence Hargrove, a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and a penchant for khaki, was a big-game hunter whose tales of conquest dominated the conversation. His handlebar mustache quivered as he spoke of tracking lions in the Serengeti, and his polished rifle rested against his chair like a trusted companion. Miss Evelyn Carter, a young woman with a keen, almost predatory gaze, clutched her camera as if it were an extension of her being. She was a photographer for a London magazine, her questions sharp, and her notebook always open. Mr. Thomas Reed, the park ranger, was a lean figure with weathered skin and a perpetual frown, his words few but weighted with authority. Their guide, Mr. Samuel Kweku, was a local man whose quiet dignity and knowledge of the jungle commanded respect. His dark eyes seemed to see beyond the trees, and his voice carried the cadence of someone who belonged to this wild place. As the steamer rounded a bend, the jungle closed in, its canopy a tangle of green that swallowed the sunlight. Miss Marple, adjusting her shawl against the humid breeze, observed her companions closely. Hargrove's brash confidence grated against Reed's silent disapproval, evident in the ranger's tightened jaw whenever the hunter mentioned his kills. Evelyn, scribbling furiously, paused to snap a photo of the riverbank, her lens lingering on Kweku as he pointed out a distant heron. Miss Marple noted the guide's slight flinch at the camera's click, as if it were an intrusion. "People are much the same everywhere," she mused, her thoughts drifting to the petty rivalries of St. Mary Mead. Here, though, the stakes felt higher, the jungle a vast and unforgiving stage. The boat slowed as they approached a makeshift dock, where porters waited to unload their gear. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the shore, where the undergrowth swayed unnaturally. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, motionless among the vines. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the rustle of leaves. "Curious," she murmured, her fingers pausing on her knitting needles. Kweku, directing the porters, seemed unaware, but his shoulders stiffened as if he, too, sensed something amiss. Hargrove, oblivious, was busy inspecting his rifle case, while Evelyn snapped photos of the dock, her lens sweeping the trees. Reed, scanning the horizon, muttered about the need to reach camp before dusk. As they disembarked, the jungle's chorus enveloped them, cicadas, birds, and the distant cough of a leopard. Miss Marple, stepping carefully onto the rickety dock, felt the weight of unseen eyes. She had no fondness for adventure, but her curiosity was piqued. The group's tensions, the guide's unease, and that fleeting shadow in the trees suggested a story far more complex than a mere safari. Tucking her knitting into her bag, she resolved to keep her wits about her. In her experience, trouble had a way of finding those who thought themselves safe. Chapter 2. The First Night. The camp was a fragile outpost carved from the jungle's embrace, its canvas tents pitched in a clearing ringed by towering acacias and tangled vines. The air thrummed with the relentless hum of insects, punctuated by the occasional cry of a night bird or the rustle of unseen creatures stirring in the undergrowth. A fire crackled at the center of the camp, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the safari party as they gathered for their first evening meal. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a folding stool, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders despite the oppressive heat, observed her companions with the quiet attentiveness of one accustomed to unraveling human nature's subtler threads. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, for the jungle's pulse demanded her full attention. The meal was simple but hearty: roasted yams, a stew of local greens, and strips of dried meat, prepared by the porters under Mr. Samuel Kweku's watchful eye. Kweku himself sat slightly apart, his posture alert, as if the jungle's secrets whispered to him alone. His face, lit by the fire's glow, betrayed a flicker of unease when his gaze met the darkness beyond the camp. Miss Marple noted this, her mind already weaving patterns from the day's observations. The steamer's journey had revealed tensions among the group, and now, in the intimacy of the firelight, those tensions seemed to sharpen. Mr. Clarence Hargrove dominated the conversation, as was his habit. His voice, loud and self-assured, carried over the crackle of the fire as he recounted a tale of stalking a rhinoceros in the Zambezi Valley. "A beast like that tests a man's mettle," he declared, his mustache twitching with pride. "One shot, clean through the heart, and it was mine." He patted the rifle case beside him, its polished leather gleaming. The weapon was a thing of beauty, custom-made, he boasted, with a scope that could pick out a fly's wing at 100 yards. Miss Marple, sipping her tea from a tin mug, remarked mildly, "Such precision must require great responsibility, Mr. Hargrove." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching the brief scowl that crossed his face before he laughed it off. Miss Evelyn Carter, the photographer, sat cross-legged on a canvas mat, her notebook balanced on her knee. Her camera rested within reach, its lens cap off, as if she might spring into action at any moment. She scribbled notes as Hargrove spoke, her pen moving with the quick, precise strokes of one, accustomed to capturing fleeting details. "Mr. Hargrove," she interjected, her voice cool and measured, "do you ever consider the ethics of hunting? These animals are endangered after all." Her question hung in the air like a challenge, and Miss Marple noted the way Evelyn's eyes flicked toward Kweku, as if seeking his reaction. Hargrove snorted, dismissing her with a wave. "Ethics? My dear girl, the jungle doesn't care for your city morals. It's survival, plain and simple." Evelyn's lips tightened, but she said nothing more, her pen resuming its dance across the page. Mr. Thomas Reed, the ranger, ate in silence, his plate balanced on his knee. His lean frame seemed coiled, his eyes rarely straying from the perimeter of the camp. When he spoke, his words were clipped, authoritative. "We're here to observe, not disturb," he said, his gaze fixed on Hargrove. "The reserve's rules are clear. No hunting unless authorized." His tone carried a warning, and Miss Marple wondered at the depth of his disapproval. Was it merely professional duty, or something more personal? Reed's weathered hands, scarred from years in the wild, gripped his mug tightly, and she noticed a faint tremor when Hargrove mentioned poachers. "Scum," Hargrove spat, "skulking in the shadows, stealing what's not theirs. If I caught one, I'd show him what a real hunter can do." Reed's jaw clenched, and Kweku's hand, stirring the stew, paused mid-motion. Miss Marple, ever the observer, let the conversation flow around her, her mind cataloging each gesture, each inflection. She had seen such dynamics before in the drawing rooms of St. Mary Mead, where pride and prejudice often masked darker truths. Here, in the jungle's raw embrace, those truths felt closer to the surface. Kweku, she sensed, was the linchpin of the group, his knowledge of the terrain and its creatures binding them together. Yet his unease was palpable, his eyes darting to the trees whenever a branch snapped or a shadow shifted. "Mr. Kweku," she said softly, drawing his attention, "you must know this. Jungle better than anyone. What wonders shall we see tomorrow?" Her question was innocent, but her intent was to probe, to gauge his state of mind. Kweku's smile was polite, but strained. "Tomorrow we trek to a watering hole," he said, his voice steady but low. "It's a place where rare antelope gather, black buck, very shy. You'll need to be quiet, Miss Carter, with that camera of yours." His attempt at humor fell flat, and Evelyn's cheeks flushed slightly. "I know how to be discreet," she replied, a touch defensive. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I'm sure you do, my dear. A camera sees so much, doesn't it? Sometimes more than we intend." Evelyn's fingers tightened on her pen, and Miss Marple filed the reaction away for later consideration. As the meal ended, the porters cleared the plates and the group settled into a quieter rhythm. Hargrove lit a cigar, its pungent smoke curling into the night air. Reed excused himself to check the camp's perimeter, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Evelyn retreated to her tent, claiming she needed to organize her equipment, though Miss Marple suspected she was eager to escape the hunter's bluster. Kweku remained by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, his face unreadable. Miss Marple, lingering with her tea, engaged him in small talk about the local flora, her questions gentle but deliberate. "The jungle must hold many secrets," she mused, her tone light. "Do you ever find people who don't belong here?" Kweku's hand froze, the stick hovering over the fire. "Sometimes," he said carefully. "People come for their own reasons, not all of them good." His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of fear. The camp grew quiet as the others retired to their tents, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She wrapped her shawl tighter, the night's heat doing little to dispel the chill of intuition. The jungle was alive. Around her, its sounds a tapestry of life and danger. She recalled the shadow she'd glimpsed from the steamer, the way it had melted into the trees. Now, as she sat by the dying fire, she heard a rustle, not the scamper of a monkey or the slither of a snake, but something heavier, more deliberate. It came from the direction of the thicket beyond the tents, where the porters had stacked their supplies. She strained her eyes, but the darkness was impenetrable, the fire's glow too weak to reach the shadows. Rising quietly, Miss Marple stepped toward her tent, her movements slow but purposeful. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her ears attuned to the night. The rustle came again, closer now, accompanied by the faint snap of a twig. She considered calling out, but thought better of it. In St. Mary Mead, one learned to listen before speaking. Instead, she slipped into her tent, leaving the flap slightly ajar to watch the clearing. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the camp was silent, save for Hargrove's faint snoring and the distant hum of the jungle. She sat on her cot, her knitting untouched, her mind racing. Kweku's unease, she decided, was not mere nerves. He knew something, perhaps about the shadow she'd seen, or the poachers Hargrove so despised. Reed's defensiveness suggested a man guarding more than the reserve's rules, while Evelyn's sharp questions hinted at ambitions beyond her photographs. Hargrove, for all his bluster, seemed the least likely to hide his intentions, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. People, she had learned, were rarely what they seemed, and the jungle, like her village, was a place where secrets festered. She lay down, her eyes fixed on the tent's canvas ceiling, but sleep eluded her. The rustle returned, fainter now, moving away from the camp. She pictured the figure from the steamer, its silhouette etched against the trees. Was it a poacher, as Hargrove suggested, or something else entirely? Her thoughts drifted to the villagers of St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced glance or a hesitant word often revealed more than a confession. Here, in this wild place, the signs were different. Broken twigs, trembling hands, a shadow where none should be. But the human heart, she knew, was the same. As the night deepened, Miss Marple resolved to watch closely the next day. The trek to the watering hole would bring the group deeper into the jungle, where tensions might surface like ripples on a pond. She closed her eyes, the rustle now a distant memory, but her mind remained alert. Trouble, she sensed, was already among them, waiting for its moment to strike. In her experience, it always did. Chapter 3. The Shot in the Dark. The jungle dawn was shattered by a scream, sharp and piercing, that tore through the camp like a blade. Miss Jane Marple, already awake in her tent, her knitting needles idle in the pale light filtering through the canvas, sat bolt upright. The scream had come from the direction of the clearing, and it was followed by a clamor of voices, urgent, chaotic, and laced with panic. She slipped on her shoes, adjusted her shawl, and stepped outside, her movements calm but swift, her eyes scanning the scene with the clarity of one accustomed to crisis. The camp was in disarray. The porters huddled near the smoldering remains of last night's fire, their faces taut with fear. Mr. Clarence Hargrove stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle in hand, though its barrel pointed downward, as if he'd grabbed it in haste. Miss Evelyn Carter, her camera dangling from her neck, was kneeling beside a figure sprawled on the ground, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her notebook. Mr. Thomas Reed, the ranger, was already there, his flashlight casting a stark beam over the scene. And there, at the center of it all, lay Mr. Samuel Kweku, their guide, motionless in the dew-soaked grass, his eyes staring blankly at the canopy above. A dark stain spread across his chest, the unmistakable mark of a bullet wound. Miss Marple approached quietly, her presence unnoticed amid the chaos. She knelt beside Evelyn, her gaze taking in the details with practiced precision. Kweku's body lay at an angle, his head tilted toward the jungle, as if he'd been facing the trees when the shot struck. The wound was clean, a single entry point just left of his heart, suggesting a marksman's skill. The grass around him was undisturbed, save for a faint trail of crushed blades leading toward the thicket, a path too subtle for most to notice, but not for Miss Marple. She glanced upward, her eyes tracing the line of the wound's trajectory. The bullet, she surmised, had come from an elevated position, perhaps a tree or a ridge overlooking the camp. Her gaze settled on a nearby acacia, its branches heavy and low, one of which bore a freshly broken twig, dangling like a clue left in haste. Reed took charge, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Stay back, all of you," he barked, his flashlight sweeping the clearing. "No one touches anything until we know what happened." His authority was unquestioned, but Miss Marple noted the strain in his eyes, the way his hand lingered near his belt, where a knife was sheathed. Hargrove, still clutching his rifle, protested loudly. "This is madness. My gun's been in its case all night. I didn't fire a shot." His bluster was convincing, but Miss Marple observed the sheen of sweat on his brow, unusual for a man who claimed to thrive in the jungle's dangers. Evelyn, rising shakily, clutched her camera as if it were a lifeline. "I was in my tent," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I heard the shot and ran out. I thought it was an animal at first." Her eyes darted toward the jungle, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or fear, beneath her composure. Reed turned to her, his tone sharp. "You didn't see anything? No one moving?" Evelyn shook her head, but her fingers tightened on her camera, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets its lens might hold. The porters, whispering among themselves in a local dialect, were reluctant to approach the body. One of them, a young man named Juma, muttered something about bad spirits before Reed silenced him with a glare. Miss Marple, standing quietly, approached Juma with a gentle smile. "You knew Mr. Kweku well, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft as a village gossip's. Juma nodded, his eyes downcast. "He was good man, knew the jungle like his own hand. He was afraid last night." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, but she kept her tone light. "Afraid? Of what, my dear?" Juma hesitated, glancing at Reed, then mumbled, "He saw something." "In the trees." He didn't say what. Reed, overhearing, interrupted brusquely. "Enough of that talk. We need facts, not superstitions." He knelt by Kweku's body, examining the wound with a practiced eye. "High-powered rifle," he said, almost to himself. "Long range, clean shot, not an accident." His words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the way Hargrove's grip tightened on his rifle, as if the accusation pointed directly at him. "Don't look at me," Hargrove snapped. "I'd have no reason to shoot the man. He was our guide, for God's sake." His indignation was loud, but Miss Marple detected a note of defensiveness, a crack in his usual bravado. She stepped closer to the body, her eyes scanning the ground. Near Kweku's outstretched hand, she spotted a small object glinting in the grass, a metal cartridge, half buried in the dirt. She didn't touch it, knowing better than to disturb evidence, but she noted its size and shape, unlike the ammunition Hargrove had boasted about for his custom rifle. "Mr. Reed," she said mildly, "might this be of interest?" Reed followed her gaze, his expression darkening as he retrieved the cartridge with a cloth. "Could be from the killer's weapon," he muttered, slipping it into his pocket. Miss Marple watched him closely, wondering why he didn't mark the spot or call for the porters to witness the find. The jungle was waking now, its sounds growing louder as the sun climbed above the trees. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the fragments of the morning. Kweku's fear, Juma's words, the broken twig, the cartridge, all pointed to a deliberate act, not a random tragedy. She recalled the rustle she'd heard the previous night, the shadow on the steamer, and Kweku's unease by the fire. Had he seen something he shouldn't have? A poacher, perhaps, as Hargrove had ranted about, or something closer to the camp. Her thoughts drifted to Saint. Mary Mead, where a misplaced word or a furtive glance often unraveled a crime. Here the clues were written in the jungle's language, broken branches, hidden trails, and the silence of those who knew more than they said. Reed announced that the local authorities would take hours to reach them, given the camp's remote location. "We'll secure the area and wait," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No one leaves the camp until we know more." Hargrove muttered something about incompetence, while Evelyn retreated to her tent, claiming she needed to check her equipment. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her eyes returning to the acacia tree. She approached it quietly, her steps careful to avoid the crushed grass. The broken twig was high, too high for a casual passerby, and she spotted a faint scuff on the bark, as if someone had climbed in haste. Below, in the soft earth, was a partial boot print, larger than any she'd seen among the group's footwear. It was deep, suggesting weight. A man, perhaps, carrying a heavy load, like a rifle. She returned to the clearing, her mind alive with possibilities. Kweku's death was no accident, and the killer was likely still near, watching from the jungle's shadows. Hargrove's rifle was the obvious suspect, but his bluster seemed too open for deceit. Or was it a performance? Evelyn's camera might hold answers, but her nervousness suggested she was hiding something. Reed's efficiency was admirable, but his quick handling of the cartridge raised questions, and the porters, fearful and whispering, might know more than they dared say. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. The jungle, like her village, was a place of secrets, and she had a knack for coaxing them into the light. As the group dispersed, Reed covering Kweku's body with a tarp, Miss Marple sat on her stool, her knitting resumed, but her eyes never leaving the trees. The shot in the dark had set a mystery in motion, and she intended to unravel it, one thread at a time. Chapter 4. Shadows of Suspicion. The jungle morning was heavy with humidity, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The camp, still reeling from the shock of Samuel Kweku's death, buzzed with a tense undercurrent as the safari party awaited the arrival of the local authorities. Miss Jane Marple sat on a canvas stool near her tent, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, a picture of serene composure. Her eyes, however, were anything but idle, darting from one face to another, cataloging the subtle shifts in demeanor that betrayed more than words ever could. The scream at dawn had torn away the group's veneer of civility, and now suspicion hung over the clearing like a gathering storm. Mr. Thomas Reed, the ranger, had taken charge with a brisk efficiency that bordered on authoritarian. He had cordoned off the area around Kweku's body, now covered with a tarp, and instructed the porters to keep their distance. His flashlight lay discarded on a crate, its beam no longer needed as the sun filtered through the canopy. "We'll wait for the police," he announced, his voice steady, but his eyes restless, scanning the group as if searching for a crack in their stories. Miss Marple noted the way. His hand rested near his knife, a habit she'd observed the previous night, and wondered if it was mere vigilance or something more. Mr. Clarence Hargrove paced near the fire pit, his rifle now locked in its case but still within reach. His usual bluster had given way to indignation, his face flushed as he muttered about the outrage of being suspected. "I'm no murderer," he declared to no one in particular, his mustache quivering. "I've shot game, not men, and certainly not some guide who was doing his job." His protestations were loud, but Miss Marple caught the way his eyes flicked toward Read, as if gauging the ranger's reaction. She made a mental note of his defensiveness, so like the blustering Colonel Bantry back in St. Mary Mead when accused of a minor indiscretion. Miss Evelyn Carter stood apart, her camera slung around her neck, her notebook clutched tightly. She had regained some of her composure since the morning's chaos, but her pale face betrayed a sleepless night. When Read questioned her, she repeated her story with a touch too much insistence. "I was in my tent, developing film. I heard the shot and ran out, that's all." Her voice was firm, but her fingers toyed nervously with the camera strap, and Miss Marple wondered what images might be hidden in its rolls of film. A photographer, she knew, saw the world through a lens that captured truths others missed. The porters, gathered in a tight knot near the supply tent, spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the jungle. Juma, the young man who had spoken of Kweku's fear, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, as if regretting his earlier candor. She approached him gently, her voice soft as a village confidante's. "Juma, my dear, you mentioned Mr. Kweku was afraid last night. Did he say anything more about what troubled him?" Juma shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Read, who was preoccupied with marking the crime scene. "He didn't say much, ma'am," Juma whispered. "Only that the jungle was watching. He saw eyes," he said, "in the dark." Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging, but Juma clammed up, retreating to the other porters. Read's interrogation of the group was methodical, but yielded little. Hargrove insisted his rifle had been untouched, though he admitted to cleaning it the previous evening, a detail Miss Marple tucked away, recalling the pristine state of his rifle case. Evelyn stuck to her story, her eyes avoiding Read's probing gaze. The porters, when questioned, offered vague accounts of hearing the shot but seeing nothing. Read himself claimed to have been patrolling the camp's northern edge when the shot rang out, a claim no one could verify. Miss Marple, listening quietly, noted the absence of any mention of the cartridge she'd pointed out or the boot print she'd found. Read's silence on these clues was curious, and she resolved to keep a closer eye on him. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple took a discreet walk around the camp's perimeter, her steps slow but purposeful. She revisited the acacia tree where she'd spotted the broken twig and the boot print. The print was still there, its edges softened by the morning dew, but unmistakable in its size. Larger than Read's sturdy boots, Hargrove's polished ones, or Evelyn's practical sneakers. She crouched, her knees protesting, and examined the ground nearby. A faint trail of bent grass led deeper into the jungle, disappearing into a thicket of thorny vines. She didn't follow, knowing her limits, but she memorized the direction, suspecting it might lead to answers. Returning to the camp, she found Hargrove arguing with Read about the delay in the authorities' arrival. "This is a damned inconvenience," Hargrove snapped. "We're sitting ducks out here with a killer on the loose." Read's response was curt. The police will come when they come. Until then, we stay put. Miss Marple, settling back on her stool, resumed her knitting, her needles a soothing rhythm against the rising tension. She recalled Kweku's trembling hands by the fire, his cryptic words about the jungle watching. Had he stumbled upon something dangerous? A poacher's hideout, perhaps, or a secret one of the group was guarding. Her thoughts drifted to Evelyn's camera, Reed's guarded demeanor, and Hargrove's too clean rifle case. Each held a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was far from clear. Evelyn approached Miss Marple, perhaps seeking an ally in the midst of suspicion. "It's awful, isn't it?" she said, her voice low. "Poor Mr. Kweku. He was so kind." Her words were sincere, but her eyes were wary, as if measuring Miss Marple's response. "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "It's a terrible thing, but I find that tragedies often reveal what's hidden. Don't you?" Evelyn's smile faltered, and she excused herself, claiming she needed to sort her photographs. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the girl's nervousness. A camera, she mused, could be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. As noon approached, the jungle's heat grew stifling, and the group retreated to their tents, save for Reed, who remained vigilant by the tarp-covered body. Miss Marple, undeterred by the humidity, sat in the shade, her knitting a pretext for observation. She thought of Saint. Mary Mead, where a sudden death, be it a fall or a poisoning, always stirred up secrets. Here the jungle's vastness amplified those secrets, but the human heart, she knew, was no different. Someone in this camp, or lurking just beyond it, had fired that shot, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who. The broken twig, the boot print, Juma's whispered fears, all were threads in a tapestry she would soon unravel, if only she could find the right stitch to pull. Chapter 5. The Hunter's Tale. The sun climbed higher, its rays piercing the jungle canopy to dapple the camp in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air was thick, the humidity clinging to skin like a second garment, yet Miss Jane Marple sat composed on her canvas stool, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the turmoil around her. The death of Samuel Kweku had cast a pall over the safari party, and the wait for the authorities stretched nerves taut. Miss Marple, however, saw opportunity in the tension, a chance to probe the hearts and minds of her companions. She decided to begin with Mr. Clarence Hargrove, whose loud presence and ever-present rifle made him the most obvious suspect in the eyes of the camp. Hargrove was pacing near his tent, his khaki shirt stained with sweat, his mustache bristling as he muttered about the injustice of being confined to the clearing. His rifle case, now locked and propped against a crate, seemed to draw his gaze like a magnet. Miss Marple, with the disarming smile of a kindly aunt, approached him, her knitting tucked under her arm. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice light as a summer breeze, "I wonder if you might indulge an old lady's curiosity. I've never understood the thrill of hunting, but you seem so passionate about it. Would you walk with me and tell me more?" Her tone was all innocence, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any flicker of unease. Hargrove, flattered by the attention, straightened his shoulders and agreed, though his glance toward Reed, who was still guarding Kweku's body, held a trace of defiance. They strolled toward the edge of the camp, where the jungle loomed like a living wall, its vines and branches whispering secrets in the faint breeze. Miss Marple kept her pace slow, her questions gentle but deliberate, designed to draw him out. "You must have seen such extraordinary places," she said, her voice warm with admiration. "Africa, India, the Americas, such adventures for a man like you." Hargrove puffed out his chest, launching into a tale of tracking a leopard in the Congo, his hands gesturing broadly as he described the beast's cunning and his own triumph. Miss Marple listened attentively, nodding at the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through his words for inconsistencies. She steered the conversation to his rifle, asking, "That weapon of yours, it's quite splendid, isn't it? You mentioned it was custom-made. Such a thing must be a marvel of precision." Hargrove's eyes lit up, and he launched into a detailed description of the rifle's craftsmanship. A .375, Holland and Holland, fitted with a telescopic sight that could drop a buck at 300 yards. He boasted of its balance, its power, and the care he took to maintain it. "Cleaned it last night, as always," he said, almost too casually. "A hunter's only as good as his tools, Miss Marple." She nodded, her smile unwavering, but her thoughts turned to the pristine rifle case she'd noticed the previous evening, its leather gleaming as if freshly polished. "And you keep it locked away at night, I presume?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. Hargrove hesitated, just for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course, can't be too careful with poachers about." His mention of poachers was sharp, almost venomous, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity. "Poachers must be a terrible nuisance," she said, her voice sympathetic. "Have you ever encountered one yourself?" Hargrove's face darkened, his mustache twitching. "Vermin," he spat. "They sneak through the bush, stealing kills, ruining the sport for honest men. If I caught one, I'd teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget." His vehemence was striking, and Miss Marple noted the way. His hands clenched, as if itching to grip his rifle. She thought of the cartridge she'd spotted near Kweku's body, its size and shape distinct from the ammunition Hargrove described. Was his anger genuine, or a performance to deflect suspicion? She recalled the boot print by the acacia tree, too large for Hargrove's polished boots, and the broken twig high above the ground. A man of Hargrove's build could climb, certainly, but his bluster suggested a temperament more suited to open confrontation than stealthy murder. As they circled back to the camp, Miss Marple's eyes fell on Hargrove's tent, its flap slightly ajar. Inside, she glimpsed a pair of hunting boots, their soles caked with mud, but smaller than the print she'd found. "You must be exhausted, Mr. Hargrove," she said, pausing near his tent. "All this waiting must be dreadful for a man of action." Her words were kind, but her glance lingered on the boots, and she saw Hargrove's jaw tighten. "I'd rather be out there, tracking whatever did this," he said, his voice low. "But Reed's got us caged like animals." He excused himself abruptly, retreating to his tent, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning over his words like pebbles in a stream. Back at her stool, she resumed her knitting, her needles a steady metronome against the jungle's hum. Hargrove's story held no obvious cracks, but his quick temper and obsession with poachers suggested a man capable of violence, if provoked. Yet the evidence, the cartridge, the boot print, the elevated shot, pointed to a more calculated act than Hargrove's bluster implied. She thought of Saint, Merry Mead, where the loudest villagers often hid the least, their noise a shield for quieter sins. Hargrove, she suspected, was not the killer, but he knew more than he let on, perhaps about the jungle's darker dealings. The camp remained tense, with Reed maintaining his vigil and Evelyn keeping to her tent, her camera silent for once. The porters whispered among themselves, their eyes darting to the trees, as if expecting the jungle itself to deliver justice. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Kweku's fear, his talk of eyes in the dark. Had he seen a poacher, as Hargrove despised, or was it someone closer, within the camp's fragile circle? Her needles clicked, and she smiled faintly. The truth, she knew, was like her knitting, a pattern that emerged only when every stitch was in place. Chapter 6. The Photographer's Lens. The jungle's midday heat pressed down on the camp, a suffocating weight that seemed to amplify the unease lingering after Samuel Kweku's murder. The clearing, once a hub of purposeful activity, now felt like a stage where each player masked their true role. Miss Jane Marple sat in the shade of her tent, her knitting needles idle for the moment, her eyes resting on Miss Evelyn Carter, who had emerged from her tent with her camera slung around her neck. The young photographer's movements were deliberate, her fingers adjusting the lens with a precision that suggested both habit and distraction. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, saw in Evelyn's restless energy a thread worth tugging. With the authorities still hours away, she resolved to probe the photographer's story, sensing that Evelyn's lens might hold more than mere images of the jungle. Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped lightly despite the heat, and approached Evelyn with the gentle air of a village matron seeking a chat. "Miss Carter," she began, her voice soft and inviting, "I've been admiring your dedication to your craft. It must be quite a challenge, capturing the jungle's beauty in such trying circumstances." Evelyn looked up, startled, her eyes narrowing briefly before softening into a guarded smile. "It's my job," she replied, her tone clipped but polite. "The magazine expects something spectacular even now." Her fingers tightened on her camera, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor, a telltale sign of nerves. They sat together on a pair of camp stools, the jungle's hum a constant backdrop. Miss Marple, with her knack for disarming conversation, steered the talk toward Evelyn's work. "Photography is such a fascinating art," she said, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "In my village, we've a young man who fancies himself a photographer, always snapping pictures at the fete. But I imagine your work is far more adventurous. Have you captured anything extraordinary on this trip?" The question was innocent, but Miss Marple's gaze was steady, watching for any flicker of evasion. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers brushing the camera's strap. "Just the usual. Birds, trees, the river from the steamer," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I was hoping to get shots of the black buck at the watering hole tomorrow." Her mention of the planned trek, now overshadowed by Kweku's death, brought a fleeting shadow to her face. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Such a pity about poor Mr. Kweku. He seemed so eager to show us those antelope. Did you speak with him much? He must have had such stories about this place." Evelyn's smile tightened, and she busied herself adjusting her camera's settings. "Not really," she said. "He was quiet, focused on his job. I mostly kept to my work." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet clicking, a soothing rhythm that seemed to invite confidences. "I suppose a camera sees things others miss," she mused, her tone light. "Insane. Mary Mead, I've known photographs to reveal all sorts of surprises. A face in a crowd, a shadow where none should be. Have you ever found such things in your pictures? Evelyn's hand froze on the camera, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before darting away. Sometimes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, but it's usually just light playing tricks. The words were dismissive, but the flush creeping up her neck told a different story. Sensing an opening, Miss Marple pressed gently. "Might I see some of your photographs, my dear? I'm sure they're quite splendid." Evelyn hesitated, her reluctance palpable, but the weight of Miss Marple's kindly persistence seemed to sway her. "They're not developed yet," she said, "but I have a few test prints from last night." She retrieved a small folder from her tent, her movements quick, as if eager to control what was shown. She handed Miss Marple a series of black and white images, studies of the jungle at dusk, the trees stark against the fading light. Most were unremarkable, capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape, but one caught Miss Marple's eye. A blurry shot of the camp's edge, taken with a long exposure, showing a faint silhouette against the trees. The figure held what appeared to be a rifle, its outline unmistakable even in the grainy image. "Oh my," Miss Marple said, her voice all surprise. "This is quite striking. Is that someone from the camp?" Evelyn's face paled, and she snatched the photo back, her fingers trembling. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just a mistake, an overexposure. I was testing the camera's night settings." Her words tumbled out too fast, and Miss Marple's smile remained gentle but unyielding. "Of course, my dear," she said. "But it's curious, isn't it? Almost like a ghost in the jungle." Evelyn laughed, a brittle sound, and stood abruptly. "I should check my equipment," she said, retreating to her tent with the folder clutched tightly. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind alive with new threads. The photograph was no accident, she was certain. Evelyn's reaction, her haste, her flushed cheeks, suggested she'd seen something she wasn't meant to. Was the silhouette a poacher, as Hargrove's rants implied, or someone closer to the camp? Miss Marple recalled Kweku's fear, his talk of eyes in the dark, and Juma's whispered confirmation. The photographer's lens, she suspected, had captured a truth Evelyn was reluctant to share, perhaps out of fear or ambition. In St. Mary Mead, she'd known young women like Evelyn, clever, driven, but sometimes caught in their own schemes. A magazine exclusive on a poaching scandal would be tempting, but dangerous. The camp stirred as Reed called for the porters to prepare lunch, his voice cutting through the heavy air. Hargrove, still brooding, polished his rifle case with unnecessary vigor, while the porters kept their distance, their eyes wary. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the boot print by the acacia, the broken twig, and the cartridge Reed had pocketed. Evelyn's photograph added a new piece to the puzzle, one that pointed to a figure lurking just beyond the camp's light. She resolved to watch the photographer closely, for her nervousness hinted at knowledge, perhaps of the killer or of something worth killing for. As the sun reached its zenith, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving a pattern from the morning's clues. The jungle, like her village, was a place of hidden truths, and she was determined to bring them into focus, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 7. The Ranger's Duty. The jungle afternoon was a cauldron of heat, the air so dense it seemed to press against the skin, muffling even the ceaseless chatter of birds and insects. The camp, still gripped by the shock of Samuel Kweku's murder, had settled into an uneasy quiet, the safari party confined to the clearing as they awaited the authorities' arrival. Miss Jane Marple sat in the shade of a sprawling acacia, her knitting needles moving with their usual precision, though her eyes were fixed on Mr. Thomas Reed, the ranger, who stood sentinel near the tarp-covered body of their fallen guide. His lean frame, taut with purpose, and his stern expression suggested a man accustomed to command. Yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of unease in his restless glances toward the jungle's edge. Determined to unravel the threads of this mystery, she decided to probe the ranger's story, suspecting his knowledge of the terrain, and perhaps its secrets, held a key to Kweku's death. Miss Marple approached Reed with her characteristic gentleness, her shawl neatly draped despite the stifling heat. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice soft as a village confidante's, "you must find this all terribly distressing. A ranger's work is to protect, isn't it? And yet, such a tragedy has struck under your watch." Her words were sympathetic, but her eyes were keen, watching for any flicker of discomfort. Reed turned to her, his weathered face impassive, though his hand lingered near the knife at his belt. "It's a blow, Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped. "Kweku was one of the best, knew every trail, every sound in this jungle. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." His words were measured, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, as if he were guarding more than the crime scene. She suggested a short walk along the camp's perimeter, framing it as a need for fresh air, though her true aim was to draw him out away from the other's ears. Reed agreed, albeit reluctantly, his boots crunching on the dry earth as they moved past the tents. The jungle loomed around them, its dense foliage a wall of green that seemed to pulse with hidden life. Miss Marple kept her questions light, asking about his years as a ranger, the animals he protected, and the challenges of maintaining order in such a wild place. Reed warmed slightly, his voice softening as he spoke of the black buck antelope Kweku had planned to show them. "They're rare now," he said, a trace of pride in his tone. "Shy creatures, but graceful. Kweku knew their habits better than anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. "It must be a heavy responsibility, safeguarding such treasures," she said. "I imagine poachers are a constant thorn in your side." Reed's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees. "They're clever," he said, his voice low. "Always one step ahead, slipping through the cracks. We patrol, we set traps, but they've got their ways." His words were vague, yet Miss Marple caught a hint of frustration, perhaps even resignation, that piqued her curiosity. "Have you ever come close to catching one?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a villager's gossip. Reed hesitated, his hand brushing the knife handle. "Once or twice," he said curtly. "But they're ghosts out here, hard to pin down." They paused near the acacia where Miss Marple had found the broken twig and boot print, and she steered the conversation to the night of the murder. "You were patrolling when the shot was fired, weren't you?" she asked, her eyes on the tree's low branches. Reed nodded, his gaze following hers. "Northern edge of the camp," he said. "Didn't see a thing, just heard the shot and ran back." His story was consistent, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided the acacia, as if he knew what she'd found there. She mentioned the cartridge she'd pointed out earlier, watching his reaction. "You kept it safe, I presume?" she said lightly. Reed's hand went to his pocket where he'd stowed the evidence. "It's secure," he said, his tone brusque. I'll hand it over when the police arrive." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking as they returned to the camp, her mind sifting through Reed's words. His dedication to the reserve was evident, but his guarded manner suggested he knew more than he shared. She recalled the bulge of papers in his satchel, glimpsed the previous day, and the map she'd seen inside, marked with routes that didn't align with their itinerary. Was Reed merely a diligent ranger, or was he entangled in something darker? In St. Mary Mead, she'd known men like him, upright, duty-bound, but sometimes compromised by necessity or greed. As they reached the clearing, Miss Marple spotted Evelyn emerging from her tent, her camera clutched tightly, her eyes darting toward Reed. Hargrove, meanwhile, was arguing with one of the porters about the placement of his gear, his voice carrying across the camp. Reed excused himself to intervene, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She settled back on her stool, her knitting a pretext for observation. Reed's reticence, Evelyn's nervous photograph, Hargrove's bluster, all were pieces of a puzzle, and Kweku's fear of eyes in the dark was the thread that bound them. She thought of the boot print, too large for Reed's boots, and the cartridge he'd pocketed with such haste. The ranger's duty, she suspected, might extend beyond protecting wildlife, perhaps to protecting secrets. The jungle's hum grew louder as the afternoon waned, and Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving a pattern from the day's clues. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of suspicion, and she was determined to bring it into the light, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 8. A Hidden Trail. The jungle's late afternoon light filtered through the canopy in slanted golden beams, casting long shadows that danced across the camp like restless spirits. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of moss and earth, and the distant calls of monkeys added a plaintive note to the stillness that had settled over the safari party. Miss Jane Marple, ever alert despite her unassuming demeanor, sensed the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on the group. The murder of Samuel Kweku had fractured their fragile unity, and with the authorities still hours away, the camp simmered with suspicion. Miss Marple, her knitting set aside for the moment, decided to act on a hunch, driven by the clues she'd gathered: the broken twig, the oversized boot print, and the cryptic hints of Kweku's fear. While the others rested or brooded, she resolved to explore the jungle's edge, seeking the trail that might lead to the killer's secrets. Slipping away from the camp was no small feat for a woman of her years, but Miss Marple moved with a quiet determination that belied her age. She wore her sturdy shoes and a light hat to shield her from the sun, her shawl tucked into her bag to avoid snagging on thorns. The others were preoccupied. Mr. Thomas Reed was checking the camp's perimeter. Mr. Clarence Hargrove was polishing his rifle case with unnecessary vigor, and Miss Evelyn Carter was in her tent, ostensibly sorting photographs. The porters, subdued and wary, tended to their tasks near the supply tent. Miss Marple's absence would go unnoticed, she hoped, for the short time she needed. She retraced her steps to the acacia tree, where she'd found the broken twig and boot print, her eyes scanning the ground for the faint trail of crushed grass she'd noticed earlier. The print was still there, its edges softened by the day's heat, but clear enough to confirm its size, larger than any footwear in the camp. The trail led into a thicket of tangled vines and low shrubs, where the jungle's density seemed to swallow the light. Miss Marple moved carefully, her steps measured to avoid snapping twigs or leaving her own marks. The jungle was alive around her, its sounds a chorus of warning and indifference, yet she felt a curious calm, as if the village instincts honed in St. Mary Mead were equally at home here. The trail, faint but discernible, wound deeper into the undergrowth, marked by occasional scuffs in the earth and bent branches. After a few minutes, Miss Marple reached a small clearing, barely more than a gap in the foliage, where the ground was disturbed as if by recent activity. Her eyes, sharp despite the dim light, spotted a shallow pit, its edges roughly concealed with leaves. Kneeling with some effort, she brushed the covering aside, revealing dark, stained earth. Blood, she suspected, though not human. The scent was faint but unmistakable, suggesting an animal had been butchered here, perhaps a poacher's kill. Nearby, she found a scrap of coarse cloth snagged on a thorn, its texture rougher than anything worn by the safari party. She tucked it into her bag, careful not to tear it further. As she examined the pit, a rustle in the bushes made her freeze. Her heart quickened, but she remained still, her village-bred caution overriding fear. The sound faded, likely a small animal, but it reminded her of the jungle's dangers, and the eyes Kweku had feared. Rising, she scanned the clearing, noting a faint path leading further into the jungle, but she dared not follow alone. Instead, she marked the spot in her mind, using a distinctive, gnarled tree as a landmark, and turned back toward the camp, her thoughts racing. Back in the clearing, the camp was stirring as the porters prepared a meager supper. Miss Marple slipped into her tent unnoticed, retrieving her knitting to mask her brief absence. Her mind, however, was far from the stitches, piecing together the morning's clues with this new discovery. The pit suggested poaching, a motive for Kweku's murder if he'd stumbled upon such a sight. The cloth, foreign to the camp, pointed to an outsider, yet the killer's precision, the elevated shot, the clean wound, implied knowledge of the terrain. Terrain, perhaps aided by someone within the group. She recalled Reed's guarded demeanor, Evelyn's nervous photograph, and Hargrove's hatred of poachers. Each held a piece of the puzzle, but the hidden trail she'd found suggested a larger scheme, one Kweku had paid for with his life. As the group gathered for the meal, Miss Marple overheard Reed on a handheld radio, his voice low and urgent, speaking of a shipment and delays. He cut off abruptly when he saw her watching, his eyes narrowing before he turned away. She made a mental note, recalling the map in his satchel, marked with unfamiliar routes. Was Reed protecting the reserve, or something else entirely? In St. Mary Mead, she'd known men who wore duty as a mask for darker deeds, and Reed's secrecy raised her suspicions. Sitting by the fire, her knitting resumed. Miss Marple felt the jungle's weight, its secrets pressing closer. The hidden trail was a thread she would follow, but carefully, for the killer was still out there, watching from the shadows. Her needles clicked, a steady rhythm against the night's unease, as she planned her next move. Chapter 9. The Poacher's Shadow. The jungle evening settled over the camp like a heavy curtain, the fading light casting long, jagged shadows that merged with the encroaching darkness. The fire at the center of the clearing crackled weakly, its glow a frail defense against the night's oppressive weight. Miss Jane Marple sat by her tent, her knitting needles moving with their usual precision, though her mind was far from the stitches. The discovery of the hidden clearing, its blood-stained pit and snagged cloth, had, sharpened her sense of the danger lurking beyond the camp's fragile boundaries. Samuel Kweku's murder was no random act, she was certain, but a deliberate strike to silence a man who had seen too much. With the authorities still delayed, Miss Marple resolved to draw the truth closer, using the group's tensions to expose the killer's shadow. Supper was a subdued affair. The party gathered around the fire with plates of boiled yams and thin stew, their appetites dulled by the day's grim events. Mr. Clarence Hargrove, his bluster muted, picked at his food, his eyes darting to his locked rifle case as if it might absolve him of suspicion. Miss Evelyn Carter, her camera absent for once, sat with her notebook closed, her face pale and drawn. Mr. Thomas Reed, ever the sentinel, ate standing, his gaze fixed on the jungle's edge, where the darkness seemed to pulse with unseen eyes. The porters, their voices hushed, kept their distance, their fear palpable after Juma's whispered tales of Kweku's dread. Miss Marple, her shawl draped lightly despite the lingering heat, observed them all, her mind weaving a pattern from the clues she'd gathered, the boot print, the cartridge, the photograph, and now the hidden pit. She chose her moment carefully, waiting until the meal was nearly done before speaking, her voice gentle but clear, carrying the authority of a village matron addressing a parish meeting. "It's a terrible thing, isn't it?" she began, her eyes moving from face to face. "To think that poor Mr. Kweku might have died because he saw something he shouldn't have." The words hung in the air, and she noted the reactions. Hargrove's fork paused mid-bite, Evelyn's shoulders stiffened, and Reed's hand tightened on his mug. "I found something curious today," she continued, her tone deceptively mild. "A place in the jungle, not far from here, with signs of, let's call it illicit activity. Blood, perhaps from an animal, and a scrap of cloth that doesn't belong to any of us." Hargrove was the first to react, his voice sharp. "Poachers, I'll wager. I told you, they're vermin, sneaking about, ruining everything." His indignation was loud, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he feared his own words might betray him. Evelyn's gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers twisting together, while Reed's expression remained impassive, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone measured but cold. "That Kweku was killed over some poacher's mess?" She smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "It's possible, don't you think? He was afraid, I'm told, saw eyes in the dark. Perhaps he stumbled upon something dangerous, something worth killing for." The camp fell silent. The fires crackled, the only sound as the group absorbed her words. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice soft but relentless. "It occurs to me that we might learn more if we act rather than wait. The watering hole Mr. Kweku spoke of, where the black buck gather, wouldn't it be a prime spot for poachers? If we announced a trek there tonight, under the guise of observing wildlife, we might flush out whoever's watching us." Her suggestion was bold, and she watched closely for their responses, knowing the killer might betray themselves in the face of such a plan. Reed was quick to object, his voice firm. "Too risky. We're not equipped for a night trek, and the police will want us here." His authority was unshaken, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand strayed to his pocket, where the cartridge still rested. Hargrove, however, seized on the idea, his eyes gleaming. "I say we do it. If there's a poacher out there, I'll root him out myself." His enthusiasm was almost too eager, and Miss Marple wondered if it masked a deeper motive. Evelyn, pale and silent, finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "It's dangerous, but if it helps find who killed Mr. Kweku, I'll go." Her words were hesitant, and Miss Marple caught the glance she shot toward Reed, as if seeking his approval or fearing his reaction. The porters, overhearing, murmured among themselves, their fear evident. Juma, standing at the edge of the group, shook his head. "Bad place at night," he muttered. "Spirits there, and worse." Miss Marple smiled kindly at him, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the group's reactions. Reed's resistance suggested he knew more about the watering hole than he let on, while Hargrove's zeal could be genuine or a ploy to divert suspicion. Evelyn's reluctant agreement hinted at a desire to uncover or conceal something. The photograph of the silhouetted figure loomed in Miss Marple's thoughts, as did the blood-stained pit and the coarse cloth. The poacher's shadow, she sensed, was closer than they realized. As the group debated the plan, Reed reluctantly agreed to lead a short trek, insisting on strict control to avoid further chaos. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm against the rising tension. She thought of Saint. Mary Mead, where a bold move, a tea party, a pointed question, often stirred hidden truths to the surface. Here the jungle's dangers amplified the stakes, but the principle was the same: provoke, observe, and unravel. The watering hole, she suspected, would reveal more than antelope. It might draw the killer into the open, or expose a traitor within the camp. Her eyes lingered on Reed's satchel, the map inside a tantalizing clue, and she resolved to keep it in sight. The fire burned low, and the jungle's chorus grew louder, a reminder of the eyes that watched from the dark. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving a net to catch the poacher's shadow. One careful stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Night Trek. The jungle night was a living entity, its darkness thick and impenetrable, pierced only by the faint glow of lanterns carried by the safari party. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers, and the sounds of the wild, chirps, rustles, and distant howls, wove a tapestry of menace and mystery. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl tucked tightly against the evening's chill, moved with cautious steps behind Mr. Thomas Reed, who led the group toward the watering hole. Her suggestion of a night trek, framed as a chance to observe nocturnal wildlife, had been a calculated risk, designed to stir the killer from the shadows. Her knitting was left behind, but her mind was as sharp as her needles, weaving patterns from the clues she'd gathered: the blood-stained pit, the coarse cloth, the oversized boot print, and Evelyn's telling photograph. The group was small, with only Reed, Mr. Clarence Hargrove, Miss Evelyn Carter, and Miss Marple participating, the porters having refused to join, their fear of the jungle's spirits too great. Reed carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the undergrowth, while Hargrove clutched his rifle, unlocked now at Reed's insistence, though his usual bluster was tempered by the night's weight. Evelyn, her camera slung around her neck, walked with a tense silence, her eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting them to take form. Miss Marple, trailing at the rear, noted their positions, her senses attuned to every sound and movement, her village instincts heightened by the jungle's primal pulse. The path to the watering hole was narrow, a winding trail of trampled earth flanked by dense foliage. Reed moved with the confidence of a man who knew the terrain, his steps sure despite the darkness. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low but firm. "No wandering off. The black buck come at night, but so do predators." His words carried a warning, and Miss Marple wondered if he meant more than lions or leopards. She recalled his radio conversation about a shipment, the map in his satchel, and his quick handling of the cartridge. Was he leading them to answers or into a trap? They reached the watering hole, a small clearing where a shallow pool gleamed under the starlight, its surface rippling with the movement of unseen creatures. Reed signaled for silence, and the group crouched behind a cluster of bushes, their lanterns dimmed. Hargrove's rifle was at the ready, though Reed had warned him against firing. Evelyn adjusted her camera, her hands unsteady, and Miss Marple caught the faint click of the shutter, a sound that seemed to echo Kweku's unease at her lens. The jungle was quiet here, the silence unnatural, as if the animals sensed a greater threat. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the opposite bank, where the trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with shadow. A rustle broke the stillness, sharp and deliberate, from the far side of the pool. Reed's flashlight swept toward it, revealing nothing but swaying branches. Hargrove's grip tightened on his rifle, his breath audible in the quiet. "Poacher," he whispered, his voice thick with anticipation. Miss Marple, her heart steady despite the tension, watched Reed's reaction. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the darkness. Then a figure emerged, a dark silhouette against the trees, holding a rifle. Not Hargrove's sleek weapon, but a crude, homemade one, its barrel glinting faintly. The figure froze as Reed's light caught it, then bolted into the jungle, crashing through the undergrowth. Reed lunged forward, shouting for the group to stay put, but Hargrove was already on his feet, rifle raised. "I've got him," he roared, his voice breaking the night's spell. Miss Marple, with surprising agility, grabbed Evelyn's arm to keep her from following, her eyes tracking Reed as he vanished into the trees. The chase was brief, the sounds of pursuit fading quickly, and Miss Marple noted the direction, toward the hidden clearing she'd found earlier. Evelyn, trembling, whispered, "Who was that?" But Miss Marple only patted her hand, her mind racing. The figure's rifle matched the silhouette in Evelyn's photograph, and its flight suggested guilt or fear. Reed returned minutes later, alone, his face grim. "Lost him," he said, his breath heavy. "Too dark, too fast." Hargrove cursed, lowering his rifle, but Miss Marple caught the glance he shot Reed, a mix of frustration and suspicion. She suggested they search the area, and Reed reluctantly agreed, leading them along the path the figure had taken. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp, spotted a trail of disturbed leaves and snapped twigs, leading to a dense thicket. There, hidden beneath a tangle of vines, was a cache of ivory tusks and pelts, their surfaces stained with dried blood. The sight confirmed her suspicions. A poaching operation, close to the camp, likely the reason for Kweku's death. Evelyn gasped, her camera forgotten, while Hargrove's face reddened with anger. "Filthy poachers," he spat, but Miss Marple noted Reed's silence, his eyes fixed on the cache as if it held secrets he already knew. She recalled the map in his satchel, the routes that didn't match their itinerary, and his urgent radio call. The poacher's shadow had fled, but the truth was closer, lurking among them. Miss Marple's voice was calm as she spoke. "This is what Mr. Kweku found, isn't it? And why he had to die." Her words were a challenge, and she watched their faces. Reed's guarded, Hargrove's indignant, Evelyn's pale with fear. The trek back to camp was silent, the weight of the discovery pressing on them all. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the night's events with the clues she'd gathered. The poacher was real, but someone in the camp had known of his presence, perhaps aided him. In St. Mary Mead, she'd seen how greed could twist even the most upright hearts. And here, in the jungle's dark heart, the stakes were higher. The cash was a motive, but the killer's identity remained elusive, hidden in the shadows she was determined to illuminate. Chapter 11. The Truth Unraveled. The camp was a somber enclave as the safari party returned from the night trek, the weight of their discovery at the watering hole pressing heavily upon them. The faint glow of the fire, rekindled by the porters, cast flickering shadows across the clearing, mirroring the unease that gripped the group. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn tightly against the night's chill, sat on her familiar canvas stool, her knitting untouched as her mind wove together the threads of the mystery. The cache of ivory and pelts confirmed a poaching operation, and Samuel Kweku's murder was undoubtedly tied to his discovery of it. Yet the killer's identity and the role of those within the camp remained shrouded, a puzzle Miss Marple was determined to solve before the authorities arrived. She called the group together, her voice gentle but commanding, like a village matron addressing a parish council. "We've seen something tonight that casts light on poor Mr. Kweku's death," she began, her eyes moving from face to face. Mr. Thomas Reed, his expression guarded. Mr. Clarence Hargrove, his bluster subdued. Miss Evelyn Carter, her camera idle and her face pale. The porters lingered at the edge, their fear palpable, but Miss Marple's focus was on the trio before her. "That cache of ivory and pelts suggests a poacher's work, and I believe Mr. Kweku was killed to keep it secret. But the question remains, who pulled the trigger, and who among us might have known more than they've said?" Hargrove was the first to react, his voice sharp. "I told you it was poachers, sneaking vermin, shooting Kweku to cover their tracks." His indignation was familiar, but Miss Marple noted the way his hands fidgeted, as if his certainty was a shield. Reed's response was curt, his eyes fixed on the fire. "We don't know enough to point fingers. The police will sort it out." His tone was authoritative, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hand, resting near the pocket where he'd stowed the cartridge. Evelyn, silent until now, clutched her notebook, her eyes darting toward Reed. "It's horrible," she whispered, "but I didn't see anything, only that photograph, and I told you it was a mistake." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles now clicking softly, a rhythm that seemed to steady the group's nerves. "Let's consider the facts," she said, her voice calm but relentless. "Mr. Kweku was shot from a tree, with a rifle not unlike the one we saw tonight. The boot print I found was too large for any of us, and the cloth from the thicket didn't match our clothing. Yet the poacher knew our camp's location and Kweku's habits, suggesting someone provided information." She paused, letting her words settle. "Miss Carter, your photograph showed a figure with a rifle, taken the night before the murder. You called it a mistake, but I wonder if it wasn't. Perhaps you saw more than you've admitted." Evelyn's face crumpled, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hide it," she said, tears welling. "I saw someone that night, near the camp, but I was afraid. I thought, if I got a picture, it could be my big story. A poaching scandal for the magazine. I didn't know Kweku would die." Her confession spilled out, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but unyielding. You kept silent to protect your story, my dear, but that silence may have protected a killer. Evelyn's sobs grew louder, and Hargrove muttered about foolish girls. But Miss Marple's attention turned to Reed. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone deceptively mild, "you've been diligent, but I've noticed things. A map in your satchel, marked with routes we didn't take, and a radio call about a shipment. The cartridge you found, too, was handled rather quickly. Might you know more about this poacher than you've let on?" Reed's face hardened, but before he could respond, Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "I believe Kweku discovered the poaching operation, and someone ensured his silence. The poacher fired the shot, but he had help, someone who knew the camp's layout, someone who could guide him." Reed's composure cracked, his voice low and strained. "I didn't kill him," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But I knew about the poacher, Jomo. He paid me to look the other way, to tip him off about patrols. I didn't think it had come to this." His confession was quiet, but it landed like a stone in the silent camp. Hargrove swore, his face red with anger, while Evelyn gasped, her tears forgotten. Miss Marple nodded, her needles still. "You didn't fire the shot, Mr. Reed, but your silence made it possible. Jomo, spooked by Kweku's suspicions, killed to protect his trade. The truth hung heavy, a web of greed and betrayal." Miss Marple's mind flashed to St. Mary Mead, where small sins often led to greater ones, and she felt a pang for Kweku, caught in a net not of his making. The poacher's shadow had a name now, Jomo, but the camp's complicity had given it form. Her needles resumed their clicking, a quiet promise that the final threads would soon be tied. Chapter 12. Justice in the Jungle. The first light of dawn crept through the jungle canopy, painting the camp in hues of gold and gray, as if the jungle itself were exhaling after the night's revelations. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the safari party sat in a weary silence, the weight of Mr. Thomas Reed's confession lingering like a bitter taste. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped despite the morning's warmth, sat with her knitting in her lap, her needles still for now, her eyes resting on the group with a quiet satisfaction. The truth about Samuel Kweku's murder had been unraveled, but the final act, securing justice, required a careful hand, and Miss Marple was determined to see it through. The local authorities arrived shortly after sunrise, their jeep rumbling into the clearing with a cloud of dust. Two officers, stern-faced and clad in khaki uniforms, stepped out, accompanied by a tracker who moved with the same easy grace Kweku had possessed. Miss Marple greeted them with her usual courtesy, her demeanor that of a harmless old lady, though her mind was sharp as ever, ready to guide their investigation. She presented the evidence she'd gathered, the coarse cloth from the thicket, the location of the blood-stained pit, the oversized boot print by the acacia, and the cache of ivory and pelts found at the watering hole. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty, and the officers listened, their notebooks filling with her precise observations. Mr. Clarence Hargrove, his bluster now a shadow of itself, stood by his tent, his rifle case locked and untouched. The officers examined his weapon first, confirming it hadn't been fired, its pristine condition corroborating his claims. Hargrove's relief was palpable, though his muttered complaints about poachers drew a sharp glance from the tracker. Miss Evelyn Carter, her eyes red from crying, handed over her photographs, including the blurry image of the silhouetted figure with the rifle. I should have said something sooner, she admitted, her voice trembling. I thought it was just a story. The officers nodded, taking the photograph as evidence, and Miss Marple gave her a gentle pat, knowing the girl's ambition had been her undoing. Mr. Thomas Reed, his face haggard, stood before the officers as Miss Marple recounted his confession. Mr. Reed admitted to aiding a poacher named Jomo, she said, her tone calm but firm. He provided information about patrols in exchange for payment, though he claims he didn't know it would lead to murder. Reed, his hands cuffed, offered no resistance, his eyes fixed on the ground. I didn't pull the trigger, he said quietly, but I let it happen. The officers questioned him further, and he revealed Jomo's likely hideouts based on the routes marked on the map Miss Marple had glimpsed in his satchel. The tracker, familiar with the terrain, nodded grimly, already planning the pursuit. Miss Marple, stepping back, let the authorities take charge. Her role as the quiet observer resumed. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where justice often came slowly, pieced together from whispers and glances. Here, in the jungle, the stakes were rawer, the consequences bloodier, but the human flaws, greed, fear, ambition, were the same. Reed's betrayal had enabled Jomo's crime, and Kweku, a man of integrity, had paid the ultimate price for his vigilance. The officers, guided by the tracker, prepared to search for Jomo, using the cache and the boot print as starting points. Miss Marple provided the cloth, its coarse. Weave a match for the tracker's description of local poachers' attire, further narrowing the hunt. As the authorities worked, Evelyn approached Miss Marple, her notebook now filled with notes for a new article. Not the scandal she'd hoped for, but a somber expose on the poaching trade and its cost. I'll make sure people know about Mr. Kweku, she said, her voice steadier now. He deserves that. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind. You'll do well, my dear, if you tell the truth. Hargrove, meanwhile, packed his gear, his earlier bravado replaced by a quiet resolve to leave the jungle behind. Never thought I'd see the day I'd pity a poacher's fate, he muttered, but Miss Marple suspected his bluster would return once he was safely home. The camp began to dismantle, the porters moving with renewed purpose under the officers' watchful eyes. Miss Marple, her knitting complete, a small scarf, impractical for the jungle, but a testament to her patience, prepared to board the steamer back to civilization. The jungle's secrets had been laid bare, its shadows no match for her sharp mind. As she stepped onto the dock, she glanced back at the trees, where Jomo still lurked, though not for long, she suspected. The tracker's determination matched her own, and justice, she knew, would find its way. Boarding the steamer, Miss Marple settled into a deck chair, her thoughts already drifting to St. Mary Mead, where new mysteries surely awaited. The jungle, like her village, was a place of hidden truths, but none could hide from her forever. With a faint smile, she opened her knitting bag, ready for the next pattern to unravel.